Okay. Hello, everybody. Good afternoon. I am Greg Kirsch, and we're going to begin our program today. I am Greg Kirsch. I'm a partner with Smith, Gambrell & Russell, and I'm also the head of the intellectual property practice of our firm. I welcome everybody to today's event. And I think it's going to be a very enlightening and very interesting event indeed. I hope, first of all, I hope all of you and your families are doing well during these challenging times. And I know that some people will be joining us here as we speak here. This event is going to be recorded. We are recording the WebEx session. This will be available later at the Conexx website. So in the meantime, I'd like to welcome everybody to the first in a series of virtual events that we are providing. And if everybody could please mute their microphones, that would be very helpful to avoid background noise. But welcome to the first in a series of virtual events that are being presented to you by Conexx, the America-Israel Business Connector. Again, I'm Greg Kirsch. I serve as chair of the Conexx Professional Connector and also a member of the Conexx Executive Committee. As many of you know, Conexx is the premier economic development organization that connects Americans and Israelis in business. Conexx is now in its 28th year of operation. During the COVID-19 pandemic, as everybody knows, the business world continues to operate, albeit in a new and different way, both here in the Southeast and in Israel and across the country and around the world. I'm sure all of you have experienced the new and creative ways that are available to reach people who might otherwise not be available via WebEx, Zoom, and the like. In this new environment and during the pandemic, Conexx has been able to implement a new fee-for-service model and has secured and helped facilitate many new projects and opportunities. In the coming weeks, Conexx will be partnering with the Israel Economic Mission, the Consul General of Israel to the Southeast, the World Trade Center Atlanta, and Young Startup Ventures and Cybertech Israel to provide discounted and free opportunities to attend online conferences and programs. In addition, we will be scheduling virtual events on the topics of business and tourism, travel in Israel, intellectual property, food technology, and other topics. I hope you will share our programs with colleagues, friends, and family. So we are using WebEx, as you can tell today, and in order to accommodate so many of you who have already joined and will be joining us, we do ask that you mute your microphone in order to eliminate background noise. So if you have not done that yet, please go ahead and mute your microphone. That can be found in either the bottom left corner of the screen or on your individual grid video picture. You can mute it either way. So the format for our program today will be for me to moderate a discussion by asking questions of our guest, Ron Lehmann. And I'll introduce Ron in a few moments here. We will cover an array of topics that I've discussed with Ron in advance of the event. We are planning to have the event, this webinar today, last about an hour or so. And we're gonna devote the first part of the event to a Q&A session with Ron. But we know that many of you might have questions for Ron as after he's had a chance to talk. And so the way we're going to do this is, if you have any questions for Ron that you'd like to ask, rather than asking them during the course of the webinar, and given the fact that it may be a little awkward and cumbersome for each of us to talk, since there's a number of folks on the session, we're going to ask you to email any questions you have to Barry Swartz, who you should be able to see in the grid here. Barry is with Conexx, and email your questions to Barry, and then he will ask the questions to Ron at the end of the session. I'll give you Barry's email address right now. It is bswartz@conexx.org. Let me spell that out for you to make sure you get the spelling right. It's BSWARTZ at conexx.org, CONEXX.org. Let me say that again just to be sure. BSWARTZ at Conexx, that's CONEXX.org. Okay, so email your questions to Barry, and then he will ask them on your behalf at the end of the session. Okay, let me go ahead and introduce Ron Lehmann, who is our guest speaker today. And with Ron, Lehmann is also his partner, Ron Citone. Both of them were helpful in setting this up today, so we appreciate that. So Ron Lehmann is a partner in Fischer, Behar, Chen, Orion and Company, commonly known as FBC and Company, which is one of Israel's top law firms. And Ron is a partner in FBC's corporate law department. His practice encompasses a broad range of corporate matters, including private equity and venture capital transactions, public offerings, and mergers and acquisitions, as well as cross-border litigation and arbitration. His practice has a strong international focus, which regularly sees him involved in a range of public and private transactions with a cross-border element. Ron also works closely with FBC's litigation practice in commercial disputes, arbitrations, and settlement negotiations involving Israeli and non-Israeli parties. Prior to joining FBC in 1999, Ron served as special counsel in the tax department of Fried, Frank, Harris, Shriver, and Jacobson, a major law firm in New York City. He also, before that, served as a law clerk to the Honorable Patricia Wald with the U.S. Court of Appeals for the District of Columbia from 1989 until 1990. So we are happy to have Ron with us today from FBC, again, one of Israel's leading and major law firms. And the way we've done this is I'm going to ask some questions. I'm going to start off kind of general, and then we're going to get a little more focused for Ron. So I guess the best way to start off this discussion with Ron is to, given that he's, sitting in Tel Aviv right now and with a major Israeli law firm, it'd be helpful to kind of get a feel from Ron about, what is the coronavirus situation in Israel? How does it affect the economy of Israel in general, and specifically its business sector? So let's start off with that question, and then we can drill down further. Ron?
So, thanks, Greg. Thanks very much for the introduction, and good afternoon or good evening to everybody. So the situation in Israel, just sort of by the numbers, we're now at a little over 20,000 cases. There have been unfortunately, just over 300 deaths in Israel. The numbers in Israel have been sort of tracking, I think, broadly speaking, what's gone on in many other countries in the world. We had the initial large outbreak in March and April. Then Israel went through more or less a 2-month lockdown, perhaps not quite as extreme as in some countries in Europe, but was a pretty comprehensive lockdown that started to be lifted in the middle to latter part of May. That helped to push the numbers down, and as the lockdown has been eased, for probably the kinds of reasons that one is also seeing in the U.S., since the lockdown has been taken away, unfortunately, the numbers have started going back up. In terms of the business sector in Israel, again, I think it's what we're seeing here in microcosm is a reflection that's not dissimilar to what's gone on in a lot of other Western countries. Certain sectors have been particularly hard hit. Other sectors, trying to sort of find their feet and try to stay on track. I guess from a certain perspective, one of the fortunate situations in Israel is that one of the engines of the economy and the sector that people are very focused on, the high-tech sector, is one that just by the nature of the work has probably been the sector that people have been able to continue working, throughout the situation, whether it's by working remotely, being able to come back into the office and work with appropriate social distancing and so forth. So I think in that sense that that sector in Israel, which is one that obviously attracts a lot of focus from business communities outside the country, is one that's been able to continue, let's say, relatively, I don't want to say unscathed, but sort of relatively consistently. Other sectors that are major parts of the Israeli economy, like tourism, have obviously been very, very severely affected. And then sort of everything in the middle. Yeah, I think, did that sort of capture what you were looking for, Greg? You're muted. Greg, you're muted.
Thank you. I muted myself. I followed my own directions, but then I forgot to unmute. Thanks, Ron. What about the financial stability of companies? I know you work, you and your firm work with many companies around Israel. Are you seeing, are they financially stable? Are you seeing kind of a mix? Are you seeing certain trends in this respect?
Right. So I looked today just to get some basic figures and basic data, just to give people a sense of where things stand. What I saw is that the economy contracted by about 7% in the first quarter of 2020. The deficit has risen to about 4% of GDP and is likely to go higher. Unemployment, which had been actually quite low. I mean, the statistics in Israel are sometimes a little bit, it may be difficult, particularly on unemployment issues, because of various sectors in the society. It's hard to get a solid handle on the statistics, but sort of taking them for what they are, unemployment, which had been quite low, say around 4%, is now went up to as high as about 25%. Quite a number of people across business sectors were furloughed. So the contractions that lots of Western economies have seen have been mirrored in Israel, and the return or the sort of opening of the economy has been, I think, like in a lot of other countries, it's been slow. It hasn't necessarily been a straight upward vector, and no one obviously quite knows what will happen, especially since the numbers on the health side, public health side, have been not so favorable. We talked a little bit about the sector impact. So sectors like tourism, real estate have been affected heavily. But another point to bear in mind is that because the domestic market here is so small, Israel is, what goes on in the Israeli economy is always very much affected by what goes on in economies in the Western world, in particular, the United States, Europe, UK, also China and India, perhaps to a secondary extent. But so long as the economies in the US and the UK are still being sort of held down by the public health situation, I think the recovery in Israel is going to be, will take time. All of this also needs to be understood in the context that naturally in Israel, as in many other countries, businesses that face difficulties are obviously sort of moving in many cases towards a kind of insolvency zone. There have been legislative changes in Israel unrelated to the pandemic, preceded the pandemic, and we can talk about those in a little more detail. But what all of that means is that the legal landscape, particularly in the bankruptcy and insolvency area, has changed and is so untested and is now really being tested by fire because of this situation.
Got it. What about in terms of travel? I know you mentioned, tourism, and I know for myself, I typically travel to Israel about 3 times a year, 2 or 3 times a year, for business. and of course that has stopped. Have you seen, from a business perspective and doing business, especially across borders, have you seen that affected, given that people simply just can't get to Israel and vice versa?
So I mean, essentially, Israel's borders have been closed for the last 3 months. There is a very small number of flights. I think there's been there are 1 or 2 flights a day from New York or from the States, but essentially, persons who don't have Israeli passports are not, for the most part, I think almost exclusively, not allowed into the country. And even Israelis who come into the country are generally forced to self-quarantine for 2 weeks. So as a practical matter, the travel into Israel is virtually stopped. I think the statistic I saw a couple of weeks ago is that there's been a decline of over 99.5% in the traffic at Ben Gurion Airport. So the numbers sort of speak for themselves. And obviously, as you say, Greg, it works both ways. So particularly in a kind of M&A sector or investment sector where people need, or certainly like to kick the tires, and in many cases probably need to kick the tires, that's, I don't want to say impossible, but it's obviously very, very difficult at this point. The government has said that the target is to reopen the skies on August 1st. But like many of these pandemic targets, that August 1st is a long way off. Nobody knows, obviously, what the health numbers are going to be. And in particular, I saw today in the paper, the headline that the EU is considering limitations on allowing U.S. travelers to come into the EU. So, if the situation in the U.S. continues to be problematic, then, that may mirror itself in Israel vis-a-vis U.S. travelers as well. And it would work, in both directions, because Israelis who theoretically could get into the United States would face a 2-week quarantine coming back, which obviously will make the travel much less attractive. Got
it. Makes sense. What about, could you maybe elaborate a little more about the capital markets, Tel Aviv Stock Exchange, public companies in Israel? How are they faring through the pandemic?
Right. So I took a look today on the sort of track of the Tel Aviv Stock Exchange index over the last 3 months, and essentially, like the stock exchanges in the U.S., things have been going quite well. There was a very dramatic fall off, I think, on somewhere to 20 to 30% in middle late March, early April, more or less the same time that stock indices fell very dramatically in the United States. There was then a sort of slow but steady climb out of that, and I would say for the last month or so, share prices, share indices have more or less been steady with little ups and downs. Based on what I saw, I think the lead indices more or less are back at where they were before the pandemic hit, which I think is sort of broadly consistent with what's gone on in the U.S. And one can ask the question, which I think the same question is being asked about U.S. markets. Why did the markets actually come back? I mean, why aren't the markets even lower than they are? And I guess the same theories that might explain it in the U.S. are probably applicable here as well.
Got it. Let's jump into maybe some more specific legal issues in Israel that I think the participants would enjoy hearing about. I'll start off with a maybe a controversial one. I know that at least in the United States, and I think in Israel as well, the issue of privacy is paramount, and it's something that people talk about or concerned about. And since we're the topic of today's webinar is COVID-19 and legal developments, it appears that Israel and the U.S. maybe are taking different routes, different perspectives on privacy issues, such as what we keep hearing about, contact tracing, where you're able to trace people's contact with each other to minimize the spread of the virus. Any thoughts from the Israeli perspective of how the government is handling this, how the private sector is handling it in terms of privacy, in terms of contact tracing, et cetera?
So, in fact, the headline in the paper or in the internet this afternoon was right on that topic. The government essentially approved the reintroduction of the possibility of the Shabak, the security service, essentially being used to help with the tracing of people who are carriers or infected. It's obviously quite controversial. The possibility for using technology in this way was put in place during I don't want to say the first wave, let's say the earlier part of this wave back in March and April. And the matter actually came before the Supreme Court because the authority that was given to the security services to be used in this way was provided under the emergency regulations that were in effect to deal with the pandemic rather than under the law that normally governs the security services. And essentially the Supreme Court said, well, it can be done for a short period and purely for purposes of trying to, address the pandemic and not for sort of private, hopefully not to invade privacy. It was once the lockdown was taken off and the economy was opened up, that authority was taken away from the Shabak. But now, as I say, just today, essentially the government reinstated it because as the numbers go up, the need for these kinds of tools is, it's becoming more pronounced. And although the privacy issues are obvious and are of concern to people across the spectrum, my sense is that it probably will be less controversial in Israel than in other countries, perhaps than in the United States. I mean, if I just take something like the mask situation, there is a requirement here for people to wear masks in public, and the fines have actually now been raised for people who are caught not wearing masks. But at the end of the day, I think for the most part in Israel, people who don't wear masks, it's not because of some deep ideological reason. It's more just it's too hot out, or it's just sort of don't feel like it. So it doesn't come with quite the same political overtones that the issue has in the U.S. from what I read. And I think the privacy thing, if certainly if it's not abused, probably will contextualize itself in a similar way. Sort of along similar lines. The other area where the privacy point came up is that the Israel police, under the emergency regulations, were also given access to information about people who had reported or self-reported that they were quarantining. And the idea was that the Israel police would have access to this information, essentially to be able to check up on whether people who were supposed to be in quarantine were, abiding by that.
Right.
I don't know to what extent they really use that authority, and it's not clear, so certainly once the economy opened up, that authority kind of fell away. It's not clear to me now, as we sort of go back into this, whether that authority will be restored to the police or whether they'll use it. But that, at least in theory, that's part of the toolbox that will be available.
Got it. Yeah, it's interesting to see the compare and contrast different jurisdictions. I know U.S. has kind of a perspective, Israel has perspective. I know some of the Southeast Asian countries have had maybe a closer perspective in that as Israel than the U.S. And so it's interesting to see different approaches and how that's played out. Let's talk about some more substantive legal doctrines here. I know that contracts are of course important in the world of business, and there's different commercial contracts in place, and of course the pandemic has caused some contracts to be contested or reconsidered. So you want to maybe talk a little about, I know that there's some doctrines in place, such as the doctrine of frustration, the issue of force majeure, et cetera. You want to talk a little bit more about how that's being handled under Israeli law, and what companies, what your clients, for example, are doing in this respect?
Sure. So just as a word of background, the principles of Israeli contract law are essentially Anglo-American principles. So the way people think about contracts in the U.S. is going to be, broadly speaking, the way contracts are thought about in Israel. There may be some doctrines that in the U.S. are doctrines that are developed through case law, and in Israel may have a statutory grounding. But the principles are principles that people will be familiar with, and I don't think the doctrines that work in Israel would be surprising to anyone who deals with these issues in the U.S. So I think in the context of the pandemic, so from a contract law perspective, there are probably three principles, and I think you alluded to, Greg, that would be relevant here. One is the doctrine of frustration, which basically is a doctrine that says that when you have a situation where a contract is not able to be performed because there have been some unforeseeable events that occurred after the entry into the contract or after the formation of the contract, in a situation like that, a contract may be deemed to be, so to speak, frustrated. And courts in Israel, like courts in other Anglo-American jurisdictions, apply the doctrine of frustration to allow contracts where those circumstances occur, where this sort of unforeseeable post-formation event occurs, to allow the frustrated contract to be terminated. And that is obviously, can be helpful for the party that's unable to perform, although it's not a sort of exculpation or exemption of that party from any potential damages. So although the frustration doctrine will allow a party not to have to pay sort of damages for full performance, other kinds of damages that contract law recognizes, both under U.S., UK principles as well as Israeli principles, like reliance damages or restitution damages, the breaching party or the non-performing party, let's say, could still be liable for those damages. Another doctrine that you alluded to is the doctrine of force majeure, which is again similar, the same kinds of concepts that would constitute force majeure as one would typically see in U.S.-style contracts. But Israeli courts, on this point in particular, look very carefully to what the specific items of force majeure that are described in the contract. The reason for this kind of careful contractual analysis actually has nothing to do with the pandemic, but it interestingly enough relates to the geopolitical situation in Israel. Because Israel historically, both domestically and in its, let's say, foreign affairs, is subject to many tensions, both in terms of potential attacks and risks and missiles and that sort of thing, and also internally because there are a lot of strikes, or historically there were a lot of strikes and labor unrest in Israel. So, if from a certain perspective, if courts took an expansive reading of force majeure clauses, one could say that there would always be force majeure in Israel, and that's obviously not really conducive to having a robust kind of contract law that's readily enforceable. So courts in Israel have typically taken the approach that if something is contractually agreed to be force majeure, then that's fine, and that will be honored. But if it's not contractually provided as force majeure, then the courts are unlikely to read it in. And that's the point where the pandemic issue actually becomes, there's a real question, because obviously, over time, historically, people probably didn't really think that much about public health issues as potential force majeure. There may have been some contracts that did refer to epidemics and force majeure clauses, but I think honestly, most lawyers would probably say, before 2020, did I think of putting that in the force majeure clause? Oh, maybe yes, maybe no. And so if an existing contract, is subject to a force majeure situation, the Israeli court will will examine carefully whether there's some reference in the force majeure clause to epidemic or pandemic or something like that. In terms of contracts that are being entered into now, that are being drafted now, I think in Israel, as in the U.S. and other jurisdictions, draft people are obviously much more sensitive to the impact of COVID-19, and the kinds of COVID-19 clauses that one undoubtedly sees in lots of U.S. transactions are making their way into everybody's form files here as well. Another doctrine that sometimes is relevant, I think it's maybe a little less relevant than the frustration of force majeure, is a doctrine called approximate performance. Which sometimes courts will say, well, we understand that you can't perform the agreement exactly the way you anticipated to do so, but you can sort of do the best you can. We can try to approximate what the parties intended, and that doctrine does exist under Israeli law. It's in the toolkit, parties should be aware of it. Having said all of that, I mean, with all of these doctrines, there's obviously a fine line between applying a force majeure frustration doctrine to a contract that has become difficult to perform versus a party trying to get out of a contract because the contract is not profitable. Courts, I think, in Israel are very sensitive to that. When you enter into a contract, you take the risks that the contract provides for. So the fact that a contract has become unprofitable, if it's still subject to performance and its performance isn't, let's say, made impossible by force majeure, I think the Israeli court, probably similar to courts in other jurisdictions, would say, well, if you end up losing money on the contract, but you're able to perform, that's just a risk that you've undertaken by entering into the contract.
Got it. Makes sense. Makes sense. Great. Let's turn to another legal area, labor law. You had talked before, Ron, about Israelis returning to Israel from overseas, and I know that there's certain quarantine rules associated with them. What do employers need to know about dealing with employees, whether they're flying back home to Israel or whether they're just otherwise have been infected or maybe a fear of infection? What do they need to know about dealing with employees that are required to remain in quarantine? Any thoughts on that?
So the Israeli law, tried to, and it was kind of developed on the fly, basically, when the situation started in March. But the basic approach is, on the one hand, if you're forced to quarantine and the government website has a form you just fill out and you send it in. You don't need to go to the doctor to confirm that you're sick in order to be entitled to sick days. The quarantine situation is obviously known to everybody, and so from that point of view, the process is pretty straightforward. On the employer side, obviously employers are not allowed to demand or require quarantined employees to come to work. Certainly nobody wants everybody else getting sick. And like other situations of people who are in a sort of temporary particular medical or health situation, like, for example, pregnant women, employers cannot terminate the employment of workers who are under quarantine because of the coronavirus. One thing that, and in terms of sick days, I think generally the idea would be that you would use your sick days for the quarantine, and any quarantine days that you would need beyond the sick days would probably be treated as unpaid leave. Although, since people who are quarantined, if they don't actually have the coronavirus, are generally healthy and can work, so then the question arises of, well, is it legitimate for the employer to ask the employee to work remotely? This is also one of these areas which is obviously kind of being developed, in real time. My guess is that, just the pragmatic view of this will be the way it will play out, if there are disputes over the issue. My guess is that as remote work has become more widespread in sectors where it's possible, it would be legitimate for employers to expect employees to work remotely. But, if we're dealing with in sectors which are more, customer facing, face-to-face customer relationships and so forth, where remote working isn't relevant, then, obviously the employees can't be required to do that. Probably the most distinctive labor law development in Israel, and I think it's similar to what's gone on in other jurisdictions, is the use of the furlough, what's called in Hebrew "Hufsha lelo tashlum" or "chalat" is the way it's referred to in Hebrew, which is essentially what the government has done. The government in Israel has essentially taken the approach of, rather than paying employers some kind of incentive amount to keep employees on the payroll, essentially the government has said you can put employees on furlough and they can then apply for unemployment benefits from the National Insurance Institute. And I believe that certainly up to a certain salary level, the unemployment or the unemployment compensation during the furlough period is 70% of the salary. So, in broad terms, basically the approach that the government has taken is put people on furlough, we'll pay them directly, rather than what I gather has happened in at least some states in the U.S. and perhaps in other countries around the world, where the government has made direct transfers to the employers to just keep the employees on the employer's payroll.
Okay, got it. Let's turn to insolvency, bankruptcy. I know that this is obviously a more common topic now, given the situation where companies are maybe teetering on the edge of insolvency. What in terms of you're as a lawyer, advising your clients different things. What do you tell your clients? What do you tell the some of the key people, officers in your companies that are clients, as to the behavior, the activities that they need to take if their company is in a situation where they are potentially insolvent or considering bankruptcy? Any suggestions on that during this time?
So this issue is really one of the key points of this new insolvency law, which was enacted in 2018 and came into effect in 2019. One of the law really tried to focus on giving companies tools to rehabilitate, and also try to, let's say, clarify what the roles of directors and officers in companies that are insolvent or were in the insolvency zone, kind of to clarify what they should do or how they should act. And so the first kind of threshold is, do the officers and directors have knowledge of the insolvency, or could they have had knowledge of the insolvency? And if they did or could, did they take reasonable measures to narrow the scope of the insolvency? And there's a lot of focus in the new law on sort of encouraging or incentivizing management and boards of directors to act rationally and make, let's say, use professional decision-making processes to the extent relevant to try to narrow the risk of the insolvency. Now, how all that applies in a situation like the pandemic is, I think, going to be one of the issues that will be tested in the courts, because I think the law is kind of coming from the assumption that companies don't become insolvent in a day. There's a kind of insolvency zone that companies go through, and one of the sort of tests for boards and directors and managers is, are you taking the right steps? Are you acting reasonably and rationally as your company is entering into that insolvency zone and making its way to insolvency? The problem here, and you know, there's no case law on the new law just in general because it's so new. But what's different about this situation is essentially overnight, companies that were doing fine, you know, essentially fell off the table because the economy locked down, and certain industries, you know, I mean, tourism is a clear example, but even things like, you know, certain aspects of real estate, you know, from one day to the next, obviously companies just had no cash flow and, you know, sort of tumbled directly into insolvency. I mean, a commercial landlord that, you know, seemed to be doing fine and his buildings were, you know, full of successful rent-paying tenants, essentially, with, you know, in the space of a couple of weeks, could have found himself with no tenants, or with tenants who, you know, couldn't pay the rent, and you know, his whole business could essentially, in an instant, have tumbled. So how these concepts of, you know, encouraging boards and CEOs to act rationally, to take steps to try to engage, let's say, in what's called under the law protected negotiations, thinking about rehabilitative structures, you know, thinking at what stage potentially to initiate insolvency proceedings. At least to my mind, you know, I'm just not sure how that model really can apply in the kind of extreme situation we have. And that's obviously something that will be tested, or is likely to be tested in the courts as we go forward.
Got it. Got it. What about creditors? I know that whenever these things happen, you know, the creditors are the first to kind of, you know, perk up and you know, wonder where they stand with respect to the company and whatnot. Are there any you know, any advice or any unusual situations where you'd have to advise a client or a company, you know, as to what to do that, you know, appropriately and what to avoid so as not to be inappropriate with respect to creditors?
Right. So I mean, I think any creditor that engaged in a business transaction with a company during the last 3 months prior to the insolvency should be taking advice from counsel, because the risk of you know, sort of fraudulent conveyance, voidable transaction, the same kinds of doctrines that would be familiar from, you know, U.S. bankruptcy law situations. Those kinds of doctrines are applicable in Israel, and I think, you know, there could be some interesting questions of, you know, back in January or February, a creditor entered a transaction with a company that, you know, seemingly was solvent, and now because of the pandemic, you know, things just sort of fell off the table. You know, to what extent is there a risk that, you know, the kind of insolvency principles that say, well, I look back 3 months before the insolvency or 6 months before the insolvency, you know, should have known that a company may have been insolvent and there was a risk of a transaction being treated as a voidable transaction. I'm just not sure that doctrine really makes sense in a situation where the move from solvency to insolvency happened sort of in the blink of an eye. But certainly any creditor, you know, that finds itself in a situation where it was doing business with a company that kind of fell off the table, definitely should be taking advice, you know, sort of sooner rather than later in the process, to make sure that its interests can be protected to the maximum extent possible.
Makes sense. We've got about 15 minutes or so left, and so I want to switch over to Barry Swartz real quick and see, Barry, have we received any questions from the participants?
We haven't yet, but if I could start off with a question, and people are welcome to send me their questions at bswartz@conexx.org. So my question is that I think there's a great deal of confusion on the part of those who live in North America about how the court system works in Israel, how judges are appointed, the role and responsibilities of the Supreme Court, which is far different than here in this country. So I just wondered if you could give us a bit of a civics lesson, Ron, about that.
The court system in Israel, I think, is generally viewed as being fair, honest, and slow. So it's a system that like any system, obviously judges are of there are all kinds of judges, and there's some better ones and there's some less good ones. But it's a system that even in a country which has had its moments of let's say occasional ethics questions in other branches of the government, I think the judiciary here has leaving aside political issues, the judiciary is well regarded. It's a system that I think is considered, and this is how we advise clients, especially non-Israeli clients, it's a system that provides a level playing field for Israelis and non-Israelis. Obviously, the system is a little easier to handle for Israelis because it works in Hebrew and it's geographically here, but in terms of the way judges look at matters, they look at things very fairly for Israelis and non-Israelis. But it is a system that's quite overburdened, and as a result, often the wheels turn quite slowly, which is one of many reasons, or one of several reasons why there is something of a move to alternative dispute resolution systems of mediation / arbitration in Israel. In fact, even in litigations in court, judges typically do recommend for parties to try to mediate. So we see more of that here. One development that I think it may be relevant, particularly to the business community, is that I think it was about 10 years ago, Israel set up an economic court, which operates in many ways similarly to the Delaware Court of Chancery, and it deals exclusively with sort of economic issues, a lot of corporate law issues. It follows Delaware precedent very closely, and the judges who sit on that court are really exceptionally highly regarded. So particularly where you have these kind of corporate law, sophisticated commercial issues, I think the Israeli court system has made great strides to sort of place itself at a level of sophistication which is actually not far off from what you would see in Delaware.
Excellent. About, go ahead, Barry. Did you have a
just going to say we have a question around liability. There's a great deal of discussion in the United States around providing legislation so that employers, those that provide service, aren't going to be sued if someone comes down with COVID. Restaurants, hospitality, sports, etc. So I just wondered if you could give me a sense of the discussions in Israel around that issue.
Yeah, I think those discussions are going on. I don't think it's been really like a headline issue so far, but that doesn't mean we won't get there. Israel is a pretty litigious place, and there are lots of lawyers, probably too many lawyers. So I'm sure those cases will come. I think probably in general the kinds of principles that will develop across other Western countries will apply here.
Great. We've talked a little bit about comparisons. We've talked about Delaware. We've talked about other comparisons with the Israeli system and the U.S. Any other maybe surprising or maybe not surprising differences or similarities between the Israeli system, Israeli laws? Whether it's one of the topics we've already talked about, breach of contract, labor law, other areas of law, but any other kind of cross-border comparisons that you can make that may surprise people or that may not surprise people?
One thought that comes to mind is, and it does tie back to contract law, although not sort of related to the pandemic issue, is what's the role of good faith in entering into contracts and carrying out contracts. And obviously all Western jurisdictions have some or another measure of or recognition of the principle of good faith, both in negotiating and in performing contracts. In Israel, those principles are anchored in the statute, in the contract law. So it's not just a kind of equitable principle, but it is a matter of the law. And I think courts in Israel tend to be a little more, let's say, assertive perhaps than their counterparts in the U.S., especially like in New York would be, in sort of trying to see a little bit of what should the parties have done. I mean, I think there's been a move away from the real kind of interventionist rewriting of contracts that some Israeli jurists, let's say, advanced in the last couple of decades. So there's been some, pullback from that, moving back in a direction towards sort of, black letter of the contracts. But I think that the overall mindset is still a little more towards, we read the words of the contract, but we do have to contextualize them to some extent. Another area that is perhaps unusual in Israeli law is protection of minority shareholders. This is particularly relevant in public companies, but even in private companies, the company's law does have specific provisions that impose duties or obligations or almost, I wouldn't say fiduciary duties, it's less than a fiduciary duty, but a kind of a duty of sort of appropriate conduct on controlling shareholders not to abuse their position. So there is a kind of sensitivity to minority shareholder interests that I think may be a little more developed, and it certainly is in the public company context more so than would be the case in the U.S. And one of the reasons that has happened in Israel is that many public companies in Israel have very substantial controlling shareholders. So the model of a public company in Israel is typically a company where there could very well be one or a small number of shareholders that hold a controlling block, and the minority is actually it's a small and let's say a diverse minority, which essentially without minority protections, particularly with respect to related party transactions that the majority shareholder could enter into, the minority could really find itself pretty much trampled. So there are certain voting protections with respect to related party transactions that I'm not sure exist in other jurisdictions, and that probably are less necessary in other jurisdictions, like, for example, the U.S., where for the most part public companies have a very wide public float. But in Israel, where the public float is much narrower, there's a greater need, and the law has responded to this to provide minority protections.
Got it. Excellent. Barry, any further questions come in?
There are no further questions at this time.
Okay, great. We've got about 5 minutes left or so, and I have some some wrap up comments to make before we adjourn. But before I do that, Ron, any closing thoughts you'd like to share that you haven't already shared with our participants?
I don't think so. I hope that we all get through this safely, and everyone and their families, and that we can reconvene to talk about topics of interest that aren't necessarily related to public health crises.
Hey, Greg, Ron Cito here. You guys in Atlanta, we here in Tel Aviv. When is baseball back? Ron is a Mets fan, so he's ready to kick your
July 24th, right?
Interesting. Once
brother
baseball
works for the Mets in ticket sales if you needed somebody.
Oh, wow.
Nice.
Very nice.
Once baseball gets back on its feet, that's a good rivalry. Go ahead, Barry.
Yeah, I was just going to say it's my understanding for our colleagues in Israel that spring training begins July 1st. First game is July 24th. And the only team at the moment that seems to be nomadic and doesn't have a place to play is my Toronto Blue Jays. So I've been listening to the radio stations in Toronto with great interest because right now they can't play in Toronto and they've had a problem with an outbreak in Dunedin. so they're cityless at the moment.
Do you still have that sign at the entrance to the city where it says "Home of the Braves '95 World Series champs" or something? Or
I think it's still there. I think it's still there.
in New York, we used to update the sign every year. You know, in the beginning of 2000.
Yeah, well, we didn't really have the opportunity to do that as much. But, someday.
I believe the Met sign was from the 60s.
Yeah.
It wasn't quite like that. Wasn't there was one in the 80s.
86.
86. Yeah.
Our signs get a little rusty, but it's still there, I think, as far as I know.
You guys are making us feel bad over in Tel Aviv.
Hey, Jonathan.
Thanks for the reminder. Well, very good. Well, this has been a great discussion. Thank you, Ron. Actually, thank you to both Ron Lehmann and Ron Citone at FBC. You can't see Ron. Actually, you just saw Ron's. There it is. There's his thumb. So thanks, Ron. Maybe you can stick you can back up a little bit. There's Ron Citone as well. Both Rons are friends of Conexx, and I know FBC has been a frequent collaborator with us over the years. So we certainly appreciate that, and of course, thank you to Barry Swartz at Conexx who helped facilitate this as well and help with the questions. We appreciate that. Also, thank you to our master sponsors for their ongoing major support of Conexx. Our master sponsors include Smith Gambrell Russell, which is my firm. Also, we have Jonathan Minnan and Alon Harnoy who are connected in from my firm, and also Berman Fink and Van Horn. I think I saw Ben Fink connected in. He may have dropped off, but he was on at one point. Also, the Zalek Foundation and Mobileye, the other master sponsors. So we appreciate their support. Overall for Conexx. I'm just going to tell you a little bit about 3 upcoming events, which I think you might be interested in. On June 26th, the World Trade Center Atlanta, I guess in conjunction with Conexx, I think Conexx is involved as well, right, Barry, with this? Yes. The World Trade Center Atlanta will host their annual World Trade Day 2020 conference, exploring cybersecurity and the global impact on trade investments. So that's on June 26th. July 16th, there'll be a Cybertech Israel virtual event, which involves Conexx as well. The topic will be cybersecurity for the healthcare sector. The University of Alabama Health System will be participating in this program. And finally, on or around July 23rd, Conexx is working with the Israel Economic Mission in New York City and the Consul General of Israel here in Atlanta on a virtual program featuring the Chief Medical Officer of Sheba Medical Center, which, as you may know, is one of its leading medical center in Israel. It's actually one of the top 10 best hospitals ranked in the world. And the program will focus on lessons learned from COVID-19 and the future of medicine. As you might know, Sheba is at the forefront worldwide of COVID-19 treatment and technology and whatnot. And so this will be an exciting event. All of these events, you'll be receiving more information if you haven't already from Conexx and from other sources. And so we certainly encourage you to attend. That is it for now. Barry, any last thoughts from your perspective?
Thank you, Greg, and Smith Gambrell for hosting this on your WebEx system. And we look forward to people who are online with us today joining us for other programs in the days and months to come.
Absolutely. Thanks again, everybody. We adjourn now, but thanks for participating and thanks for attending. Ron, thanks again.
Thank you.
Take care. Have a good day.